If you don't like spoilers, I suggest you look away now. Hello! In this video I am discussing the Lady Astronaut series so far, books 1 and 2, and the character arc of Elma York, who is the main character in this series. Why are you not reviewing all 3 books and her complete character arc, I hear you ask? Well, I currently don't have the 3rd book, so for context, what has happened in the series so far is that our character Elma York has managed to get women on the Space Astronauts program. She has been working on the moon for several months, and then she was strong-armed into joining the Mars mission. And by the end of the 2nd book, we have arrived at Mars, and that's the end. Although technically there's an epilogue, and then we come back 5 years later or something, and then Elma gets to go to Mars. But that's the context for what we're discussing. And Elma's growth so far, I feel, has been really interesting, and it feels like she's at the edge of something. I feel like she's at the end of her first stage of progression through her personal development. At the beginning of the 1st book, she is really apologetic, she's really anxious, she's really nervous all the time, and she just lacks the self-confidence to stand her ground. So when somebody's doing something crappy to her, or she needs to stand up in some situation, she just can't do it. But the whole way through, she is desperate to become an astronaut, and her drive to become an astronaut in the 1st book pushes her into so many situations where she is front and center, where she has to speak to the public, she has to speak to bosses, she has to speak up in meetings, she has to speak up to her colleagues, and it really brings her anxiety to the forefront. And it really physically and mentally almost breaks her. She can't function, she is suffering from severe physical symptoms from this anxiety, and she basically just has a really crappy time. And she has to deal with this anxiety on top of having to deal with all the other stuff that's coming her way, all the astronaut tests, all the sexism, everything is just piling itself on top of her. But in the 1st book, she manages to go from being completely overwhelmed by her anxiety to accepting it, to even discussing it in a meeting with her colleagues and admitting to taking the drug Milltown, which is like the anxiety helping drug that was really popular in the 60s. So by the time we come to the end of the 1st book, she's almost fully got her anxiety under control and her social issues. She's almost got it. And at the very end of the 1st book and into the 2nd book, she becomes a fully fledged astronaut, and she starts living on the moon and she starts working on the moon. And she's starting to get bored, but then out of the blue, she's forced to join the Mars mission when that wasn't the plan, and suddenly she becomes the center of attention again because she has replaced somebody else, and everybody is pissed. It's a really crappy situation, and it brings out all the old feelings of anxiety and confidence problems, and suddenly it's all in her head again after she almost had it down. So she's climbed all the way up and then she's coming back down again. But actually, by this point, she's developed enough where she can talk about it. So she's having problems and she's having the feelings resurfacing, but then she's able to talk to her husband about it. And then she's also able to talk with a colleague about it and assuage their fears and also make herself feel better about it. But the area that is most interesting in her development is in her relationship with Parker, who is, in the 1st book, he is her arch nemesis, and in the 2nd book, he becomes her mission commander, and how this relationship impacts her understanding of her white privilege and her unconscious bias and racism. And she had been fighting for so long on the behalf of women to be able to join the space program that every time she got a win, she was blinded to the fact that the systemic racism was just excluding almost all people of colour from the program. For example, in the second book, she didn't notice when every single time the daily jobs were being handed out that all the black people were getting the routine maintenance jobs and they were never getting the jobs that were related to their technical specialization. Specialist field. That's the one I was looking for. And when it was pointed out to her, she was baffled, and instead of accepting this as a problem, she tried to explain the people of colour's experience to them and say, oh, well, it must have been this, because she doesn't want to accept the truth, and she doesn't want to have to accept that what she's been fighting for so long is still so flawed. And these problems eventually result in the death of a crew member, and it's so sad. I definitely cried. And again, as a tie-in to the first book, these racial problems and then these arguments about race in the second book bring back her anxiety problems. And it starts coming up again, but she's able to talk about it, she's able to slowly deal with it, and then it doesn't become as much of a problem as it was in the first book. So that was really nice to see this huge monster of a problem wasn't solved, and it was resurfacing every so often, and how she was able to deal with it differently each time. It was really interesting to see that. But the linchpin that helped her understand her white privilege was a really important moment with Parker, her arch nemesis / mission commander, which was a bit of a weird relationship, to be honest. For some reason, he had always hated her, and towards the end of the first book, we find out that this was because during the war, she reported him to the general for sexual misconduct, and he was actually court-martialed? Is that the phrase? He was investigated anyway, and he almost lost his job as a pilot, which is a big deal if you're a pilot. That's not cool. And from then on, he's always hated her for almost making him lose his amazing job. But it was always a bit weird. His intensity of hatred was always a bit too much, and it never explained his actions towards her or the things he said towards her. But then in the second book, they're having an argument, and he reveals the fact that his wife back on Earth is in an iron lung, which is something that helps people breathe when they have severe polio. And then Elma realizes that this whole time he hated her and he was doing and saying all these awful things is not because he has this insane hatred, but it's because he's anxious about his wife and he's worried about her health and he's worried about his family, and he just takes this anger out on Elma as being an easy target, as somebody who he already doesn't like. So it's so easy to just take it out on her. This moment is really beautiful because it forces her to recalibrate, and she decentralizes herself from a lot of the situations that she's dealing with, and she's able to refocus the argument and move it away from herself, and is able to understand where other people are coming from, which is all we ask for in life, really. It's just to understand each other. And towards the end of the book, there's a really beautiful moment where sadly Parker's wife has died. There was a power cut on Earth, and the iron lung that was keeping her alive has failed, and then she's died. And Elma's the only one who knows, and she's comforting him in his grief. But instead of giving him what she thinks he needs, which she has done all throughout the rest of the book and the previous book, she gives him what he actually needs. And they have this little moment of understanding that's just so heartwarming. And at the very end, there's a moment where Parker lapses into his slightly offensive humour. It's not really funny, it's a bit sexist. And instead of being hurt and personally wounded and then lashing out at him and causing another huge argument, Elma just fucking owns it, and she meets him on equal ground, and I just wanted to reach through the page and high-five her in that moment, because she finally figured out where he was coming from and how she needed to react in response to that so that she was still comfortable with the situation, and it also dealt with the other people in the situation really well. And at the very final moments in the book, they reach Mars and she's not allowed to descend to the planet, which is almost an identical mirror of what happened when she flew to the moon, where she was allowed to fly to the moon, but she wasn't allowed to land because sexism. But with the Mars situation, she's not allowed to land because they need the reliability of her understanding of maths and her ability to predict and calculate numbers and stuff. And she accepts that decision and she's like, yeah, it makes the most sense. Otherwise, somebody might get hurt like the last time. Don't want that to happen again. And I was so pleased that she was able to decenter herself and just remove her own ego from the situation and do what was best for the team. Can't wait to see where her character goes next. It's a chunky beastie. And that was a deep dive into the character of Elma York, the main protagonist in the Lady Astronaut series by Mary Robinette Kowal. Really need to buy the third book. I hope I'll see you in my next video. It's probably going to be something interesting. But until that time, I will speak to you in the comments. Makes me uncomfortable.